You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to a First Contact special where we will be reviewing Star Trek Beyond. We should say from the outset that this discussion is going to include spoilers throughout, so if you've not seen the film and you don't want to know what happens, then please switch off now. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Alex.
Well, Alex, Star Trek Beyond, 3 years ago when we came together to talk about Star Trek Into Darkness, we gave it a pretty good review on this podcast. I feel time has changed our views a little bit, but Beyond seems to be a completely different beast. I guess to start off, what were you thinking in anticipation of this film? What did you think of the marketing and the trailers overall?
So, I mean, yeah, the shadow of Into Darkness does sort of loom over it a little bit. And I think, as you say, both you and I, in our review of that film, were pretty positive at the time. Something that we've perhaps reassessed a little bit. Although I'd still stand by, I'm not as ardent a critic of that film as a lot you'll find online. I think it comes under some undue criticism, but I'm not going to pretend for a moment that it's some filmic revolution. It's a summer blockbuster, and it's a bit of a retread, let's be honest. But let's move away from that. With the new film, where you have that in mind, and you have the whole thought of, are they going to try and move away from elements of that with the new film, especially you've got the looming thing of it being the 50th anniversary. It has meant that all of the behind-the-scenes stories, with the changing of the guard, the changing of writers, Simon Pegg coming in, at one point you had Carl Urban very uncertain as to whether he was actually going to be in the film. It was concerning, and then that trailer hit, and I think that trailer was dreadful, frankly.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. It did nothing to reassure you that Justin Lin, the incoming director, following the departure of Roberto Orci, really had a handle on Star Trek. It was, here's a big bombastic action movie, and I think a lot of people were concerned at that time, it would be fair. But let's not forget, that trailer was somewhat rushed out just so they could attach something to Star Wars to get a bit of hype. It feels now that maybe wasn't the best idea.
Well, no, and it was only shortly after that trailer was released that you had Simon Pegg coming out and saying, please don't pay too much attention to that trailer, that's not indicative of the film that I wrote. Which is a really weird state of affairs to be in. And it didn't sort of add to your confidence going in that the team promoting the film are not on board with the writer's vision. It made you wonder, well, is the director on board with it? And when all you're presented with in the trailer is a sort of a string of action scenes and a Beastie Boys soundtrack, it didn't fill you with great promise. And certainly, as I went into the cinema, I had that trepidation, to be honest. I wasn't particularly expecting anything of it, I'll be honest. And when I sat down to it, it was one of those cases where you have a bad cinema experience. Turn up, someone's already in your seat, you try and say, can I have my seat back? And they say, well, how about you have this one? No, I'd quite like the one I paid for, thank you. Well, meanwhile, the people on my other side, the man I was sat next to gave his girlfriend a running commentary in which he explained everything that was happening in the same way that Arnold Schwarzenegger will do so on a DVD commentary, explaining, and now this is the scene where they go into the room. It's a scene. Cheers, Arnie.
Well, similarly, I had an unfortunate cinema experience with this as well. There were two people in front of me who decided, first off, to go against when they saw the sign saying you can't record this. They thought, I'll prove you wrong, got out their phones and started trying to record. Then they were spoken to, and then they got their beers out and started toasting everything that happened on screen and chatting throughout the film, and generally being unpleasant. I, for once, spoke up and told them to be quiet, and that didn't seem to have a lot of impact. But, you know, I feel it did slightly tarnish my viewing experience of the film.
Yes, same. And that can be something that really spoils the experience. Certainly, in the case earlier this year, on seeing The Hateful Eight, the person sat next to me took 3 phone calls during that film, which is an extraordinary breaking of the Wittertainment Code of Conduct, unlike I've ever seen before in my life. So I would have expected that to have had an impact on how I felt about the film in some small way. Just, you know, a bad experience will always tarnish that. Therefore, I felt it was to the credit of the film that it didn't really have that effect, and I quite enjoyed it. Now, that's not without certain caveats, and I should say to anyone listening, we haven't actually spoken about our thoughts on the film. You've got a review up on the website on thespoilers.com of the film. I've not seen your review yet, and certainly we've not spoken about our thoughts, but my personal view was I quite enjoyed the film. There's some issues, as I would say you probably have with any summer blockbuster, but it was a lot better than I was expecting, yet it wasn't quite the film I was expecting to see.
Yeah, I can get on board with that. I think my general opinion is it's a very likeable film, and is probably the closest thing we'll ever get to seeing what this particular cast would look like in a TV show. I think it has a very televisual Star Trek quality about it, and I'm not saying that in a bad way at all. I think for once, although, you know, you do have this star base, which has apparently millions of people on it, the stakes are not the universe will end, Earth is in danger, nothing like that. So they've lowered the stakes, and it's just, we say this quite a lot on the normal podcast, it's like a solid mid-season episode. It's pretty entertaining, it's quite funny in places, it's got some flaws, but overall, yeah, it's good. You can't really complain too much about it. It doesn't have any big ideas, I don't think, which Star Trek often is given credit for, but it's not always been about that, and it does have some very nice character moments, which have perhaps given way to big action sequences in the films in this particular incarnation up to this point.
No, I'd agree with all of that, and in fact, I do feel that some of the elements of what you were talking about there have the potential to cause a division in the opinion of Star Trek fans on this film. Well, to be honest, in much the way that we've seen in some of the early reviews. It's been said quite a lot that, yeah, this is kind of like watching a big screen version of the show from those original 3 series. And I think there's certainly something in that. And at the same time, that is what could cause that division I was talking about. Especially if your point of reference with Star Trek wasn't the original series. If your primary point of interest is The Next Generation or later, I could very much understand why you would struggle to get on board with this film. And that doesn't mean for a second that I'm saying, you know, that everyone who loves the original series is going to, you know, obviously them therefore fall in love with this, because I don't think that's the case either. This is a separate beast from the original series in exactly the same way that the previous 2 films have been. But in its DNA, it probably shares more in common with that than it does with, again, The Next Generation. It's much less, as you say, about those big ideas, and essentially it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of like taking an episode of the original series and doing it large on the big screen, doing the sort of things that you couldn't do on a television budget, which normally, of course, is the way. If a TV show is progressing to the cinema, that is the route you would take. In many ways, the route the Star Trek films took from the TV series made them something a bit separate from the TV series. Now, I realise that a lot of people might disagree with me ardently here and say, no, it's very much a continuation. But I think there's a lot of examples where it's not. I mean, obviously the first film, the motion picture, is almost like a Kubrickian take on the series. It's far removed. 4 is a comedy, essentially. And I always feel the films take a different route to the TV series, but this is much more in that sort of vein.
I think it was Red Letter Media compared the first film. They said, it's like if someone was just making an adaptation of the original series, and just like the Lost in Space film from the 90s. That's what it was like. But it's so much to deal with that first film. It was getting that crew together. It was tying it in with the present continuity in some way. And I think it did it admirably. Over time, I think I've come to admire that film more and more. I think it actually does a great job. But this is actually that. This is, what if we just made a Star Trek movie now, and we assume you know all these characters, but we're going to put new actors in those roles. This is an episode of the original series on the big screen. It's that translation, and it's a bit more shallow, perhaps, but I think people are dreaming somewhat if they think that the original series wasn't very shallow at times.
Yeah. And I think that this is, at this point, before we get into any deeper review of the film, this is the fundamental argument that most people watching this film, most Trek fans watching this film, are going to have. Can you get on board with that idea that this film is that writ large, rather than say some of the previous types of films that we've had? Though that said, I would hasten to add that I would say that films like First Contact treated the Next Generation in much the same way that I feel that this treats the original series.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. Captain Picard throughout the movies is not the same character as he was in the films. He's an action hero who is going out to get the girl. He's a lot more Kirkian, and that's fine. I understand you've kind of got to scale things in movies and maybe simplify emotions. But Next Generation, essentially, as a show, was never really suited to the big screen. That cast was not suited for action movies. This cast, yeah, they're fine. But I would say even with this film, it's a huge tonal shift from the last two, which you might accuse of actually taking themselves a bit too seriously. I would say this one, in terms of tone, is actually verging more towards something like Galaxy Quest. There are certainly moments in there where they're having little sly winks to camera and maybe even digs at the tropes of the original series, where you're walking that very fine line, and I think they walk it well, where it's fairly close to parody at points, especially in the opening segments.
There's certainly something in what you're saying there. I would agree that amid all of the action, you have some incredibly earnest moments at points that sort of take you aback at how earnest they are. In fact, the podcast for Empire Magazine talks about that, and talks about how in their choice of director, Justin Lin, obviously replacing J.J. Abrams this time around, actually kind of seems suited to that from his work on the Fast and the Furious films, which you'll be far better placed to advise on than I will, having heard you on Kermode and Mayo's show talking about Fast and the Furious. But they mention about how that film will sort of be action and then suddenly switch into people stood around a garage sharing a beer. And that's not far away from this. It does sort of constantly switch between big action set piece and then characters just talking their way through a scene, essentially, and pairing people off more or less, sometimes into pairings that we just haven't seen in this new continuity, essentially. Which perhaps was kind of needed at this point, especially, say, with Bones. Bones got a really raw deal in Into Darkness. Just wasn't in it very much at all.
I think that's very much the case, and it's very difficult to give all these characters a moment in all these films, and you would argue that basically with every single Star Trek film up to this point. I don't think the Next Generation ever managed to give all its characters something to do. They were always really struggling with the secondary characters, and it was almost the Picard and Data show for much of it. And the last two films, they've established them, and when you're only doing one film every 3 or 4 years, as they seem to be, it's nearly impossible to get to know any of these characters other than their larger life in pop culture as a whole. So you've got, Spock is logical, although arguably in the last couple of films he's actually been more of an angry young man type character in these, and Kirk is a ladies' man, and it's all played very large. And in this film, the only two characters who have an arc, the only ones who go through any kind of change, are Kirk and Spock. But McCoy plays a huge part, and as he always did in the original series, he's the sounding board for both of them. Really nice scene, the Doctor as a sort of bartender, quite literally in this sense, listening to the problems of the captain, the only person on board the ship who actually has the captain's ear is the Doctor. And then you have him playing off Spock in an extended sequence, and that's really great because Karl Urban is fantastic in the role. He really inhabits it. He has all the traits that DeForest Kelly brought, but he also makes it his own. You've got to say at this point, the casting of these films, to build a franchise on and still have them recognisably these characters, which I don't know if anyone else has ever really pulled that off. Great job in 2009, because it really has worked and they really have grown into it, and you're never actually questioning that these are these characters, and they are in fact, although they have differences, they are the same characters. They have the essence of these original series characters.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And in fact, in this film, I was noticing perhaps a few more instances than I did in the last one of sort of, that's very reminiscent of the original actor, especially with Kirk. Watching Chris Pine's performance, especially towards the start, I was thinking, there's some interesting sort of Shatner-esque deliveries of lines there. I was also quite pleased with John Cho in this film as Sulu. The supporting cast all had their moments, though obviously, as you were saying, it's mostly Kirk, Spock and McCoy, but that's kind of the way it should be. They all had the rest of them all had their points, but it shouldn't overshadow things. And Chekhov obviously also gets a good run around in this film, and was also very enjoyable. Obviously, sad loss with Anton having died before the release of the film. But going back to what you were saying before about we're sort of expected to know the cultural history of the characters, that sort of plays into the way that this film starts. And it's probably a good point to be getting into this film now. In that, where we're joining the crew, having seen in the previous film them setting off on the 5-year mission at the end of another film where we thought they were just about to set off on the 5-year mission, as we've talked about before, having Bond syndrome. Oh, now he's James Bond. Oh no, now he's James Bond. So what was interesting to me was that I just assumed we'd sort of be a few months into that 5-year mission. Instead, what the writers have chosen to do is basically set this film past the television series. Now, obviously, the television series isn't in this continuity, but they're taking the idea that you could sort of imagine that those 3 series worth of adventures have happened to this new cast, and now we're seeing what happens next, which is kind of a brave move in a way, because you're sort of accelerating things along to now Kirk being slightly disenfranchised with the idea. I was kind of surprised that they did it. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. I from the point of view of someone who has seen some of the original series, I'm fine with it in that regard. I wonder how someone who didn't have that familiarity would feel about it, though.
It's quite strange because all the way through this current incarnation of the franchise, obviously the first one is kind of a Kirk and Spock origin story. How did they become the men they were? What were they like when they were at the academy? What were they like as children? And so you're on this race by the end of the film to get Kirk into the captain's chair, where you have this preposterous situation where you have a cadet promoted to captain because of what he did in the field. And fine, you buy that. That's okay. And then in the second one, they were like, okay, we acknowledge that was wrong. And then they demote him and then promote him again within 5 minutes. And you just think, oh yeah, you totally got that. That's exactly what the complaints were about from fans. When actually they should have just kind of let that go, because that was the way they were going to go with it. Or if they really wanted to do that, they could jump forward a bit, have Kirk having played the lieutenant or lieutenant commander and end up getting promoted in the field to captain and being heroic rather than being a cadet. Fine, whatever, but I like this because now we do have a captain who we can believe has been out there, he's been there, done that, seen it, he's got all this experience, and now he is a little bit jaded. We're not believing it's basically this teenager who doesn't know what he's doing. He's got the authority because he has steered this crew through 3 years of missions, and that captain's log really is a beautiful thing because it's just, you know, the way he's saying my life has become quite episodic, which is basically saying, yeah, all the original series episodes, that's just happened before now, which is why this movie essentially could be the first in a franchise if they really wanted to frame it that way. I do really like the opening. I suppose with a caveat, if we want to get into a plot element, we have Kirk acting as a diplomat, I suppose a very sort of next generation idea, delivering an artifact to what looked like giant aliens in a sort of forum, and then it turns out they are tiny sort of toy looking aliens, and that is so Galaxy Quest. It's so parody, but it's fun and it's very entertaining. It's quite a good way to start the movie, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sort of thing, isn't it? That sort of jokey element, because that's been present in the last 2 films as well. And it's again that sort of divide in the Star Trek fandom. I could see how that put people's backs up. But then at the same time, I'd sort of present the voyage home, and you go, well, it's not always been quite so po-faced. It's just that that's the way the television series would develop to an extent, and then that would have an effect on the 4 next-gen films. Though, that said, there's some insanely stupid stuff in some of those next-generation films. Whoever thought we'd be talking about the firmness of the crew's breasts, but, you know, hey-ho. But I think the setup works for it. If you hadn't had Into Darkness, I don't think it would have worked in the same way, but despite the fact that at the end of Into Darkness they're only just setting off, we can sort of see how things would play. We could see why. We've seen him beating heads with the Federation. It's believable enough. And I kind of feel that they needed to make that break, because in the lead up to the film, before we knew the title, any of the plot details, anything along those lines, there had been that talk of, well, which bit of Trek are they now going to go and remake again? I think it was important at this stage to sort of mark their flag in the ground and say, no, we've moved past now and we're doing something else. And it kind of brings it in line with those original films as well, in a way, because for so many of those films there was that whole thing of, we're getting too old for this. which obviously you can't say with this cast, but you can certainly play on the idea of them being disenfranchised in a sort of similar way.
Well, I think the motion picture kind of deals with that in some ways, because Kirk has returned, and I've read the novel of the motion picture because, you know, I'm cool that way, which Roddenberry apparently wrote, but also apparently didn't write. And it's all about Kirk having returned home as a hero. There was all these 5-year missions, and apparently the Enterprise is the only ship that returned. So they're actually world famous by this point, and everyone's promoted, and Kirk's taken out the chair because they can't send him back out because it's too dangerous, because they'll lose their most valuable asset. And so he becomes completely disenfranchised with Starfleet, and thinks about walking away. I mean, I don't think you get a lot of this actually in the movie, but it's kind of the idea.
Would have been nice to have had some of that rather than, 7 of the minutes of the model shot, but...
But actually, the motion picture, that's Star Trek at its most po-faced. And again, you could start with Star Trek 2 as the first film in that particular incarnation of the franchise, and you don't miss anything. But you get all that about, am I too old to be doing this? What have I done with my life? Was this a good way to spend my time? Will the ghosts from the past come back and haunt me? But I think everything in this particular run of Star Trek, it does have to accelerate the cast's the arcs in some ways. So you do have this slightly jaded Kirk, even though you think, come on, you've hardly been doing this and you've been having all these amazing adventures. But I think it very much works, especially in that thematically, him realizing he's the same age as his father was when he lost his life. And I think that's quite an interesting angle to play with Kirk, who has been in some ways quite light-hearted, kind of quippy action hero. You could in some ways say he's just, generic kind of modern day millennial kind of action hero, like Star-Lord, I suppose, a bit like Tony Stark. He's that guy. He's more Han Solo than Kirk, but I think he gets a nice little bit of weight in this film, which I like. I'm glad it's there, even if it's it's not overpowering. But him thinking of walking away from the Enterprise, I quite like that, which is something you would never think Shatner's Kirk would do, because the Enterprise was just the thing that defined him. That's what the motion picture's about. Him coming back, him stealing command because he just has to be on the bridge of this ship.
No, you're right. It's brief, but it's there, and in some ways, by not focusing on it too much, it plays more strongly, I suppose. It's also quite nice after 2 films of them sort of trying to say, look, these are definitely the same characters from the previous series. Look at all the ways they're the same. This film starts by analysing one of the major differences by the way that they've set this up, which is, as you say, the effect that the loss of Kirk's father has. It's good ground to explore. I don't know how far you want to explore it, but it's worth bringing it up. It's good. It's different. It's something that we haven't had, and I approve of that. On the subject of things that are sort of shown without great reference to them, it's probably a good time to just acknowledge the whole debate there's been around Sulu.
Yeah.
And there's been strong arguments on both sides of the case on that. However, having seen the film, while I can entirely respect George Takei's point of view, I thought it was handled pretty well, and actually I did kind of appreciate the way it was done, I'll be honest.
It's perfectly played, in that Star Trek has never had a gay regular character, and when it has dealt with any LGBTQ issues, it has been very heavy-handed, and this is something that shouldn't, in the 21st century, be an issue of the week. And here, he just happens to have a partner and a child, and the sexuality doesn't matter, and that's exactly as it should be. No one mentions, hey, Sulu's got a boyfriend. It's just, it's played perfectly. It's not made an issue of, but it is there, and that's good. That's progressive. It shouldn't have to be progressive, but it's a step for Star Trek which it has not taken up to now.
And it does make it hilarious, those arguments in advance of, well, we saw in Star Trek 6 that Sulu has a daughter, so he can't be gay. Whereas this film just goes, he's got a daughter, and he's gay. What of it? Again, absolutely perfect, exactly the way to play it. And as we say, with George Takei's argument, I get it. I understand you weren't playing that character that way, but you know, in brief bits of acting, I've played characters, and if someone turned around to me and said, I don't know, the person you're playing, by the way, is incredibly right wing. Well, it never would have had any influence on what I was doing in what I was playing. It just wouldn't have come up in the material that was being dealt with. So I don't really understand how it would affect. It's difficult. So I don't want to sort of second guess George on any of that. And as I say, I entirely respect his views on it. But I do actually agree with Simon Pegg that it wouldn't have had the same effect if it had just been another character. To have it as one of the regulars, and especially Sulu, because of the association that the original actor who played Sulu has, it makes much more of an impact. And I thought it was an entirely justifiable thing to do, and kind of an important thing to do at this stage. 50 years in, it kind of needed to happen.
George's argument in some ways is that this isn't how Gene intended it to be. And I can understand that. I can absolutely appreciate that. But although Gene Roddenberry originated Star Trek, he is not all of Star Trek. And it's not everything. And let's be honest, not to denigrate any of the work that any of the supporting cast did up to this point, they are basically extras with names in most of Star Trek, most of the movies. To give them any backstory now is not really contradicting. Sulu didn't have a name, and neither did Uhura. They didn't have first names until the late movies. So I think you would still argue that Sulu probably didn't have a lot to do. And this is... because this is being talked about so much, it's been given so much weight. Whereas if it were just a straight relationship, if he was meeting his wife and child, people wouldn't be talking about it. So in some ways it's good they're talking about it, but I suppose now this has happened in Star Trek, this is established for this version of this character, and we can all move on and say, same-sex couples are normal, and that was never the point of the film anyway, but I think it's a nice touch and very welcome.
And just to get back onto the note of pacing of the film, I don't know how you felt about these opening scenes, where essentially we're mostly, aside from a little bit of action with the diplomatic scene, we're largely dealing in sort of talking and interpersonal relationships. It did sort of put me in mind of the way that, say, Wrath of Khan or Search for Spock start. And I can already feel the knives of Trekdom coming out towards me for that statement. But it's a similar kind of setup, the way that those films start. I kind of liked stepping back into that. That said, we get through that very quickly. It's really not very long before the Enterprise is under attack. An attack that I thought... from the trailers, I was absolutely going to hate. I thought blowing up the Enterprise again just seemed terrible. The idea that the ship is essentially disposable now. Having said that, while I still sort of am a little bit uncomfortable with that, especially the way that how quickly at the end of it, there's another Enterprise, never mind. I don't know that you could have done the story they do here just by some other means of, I don't know, the transporter going wrong or something like that. That would have felt more of a cop-out in a way than to strand them in this impossible circumstance in the way that they do here by destroying the ship.
Yeah, it's both thematically and in terms of the story, it's let's separate the crew from the ship, and that's, taking away what Kirk loves to make him realise what he's destined to do, and also taking away a lot of the resources they have on board that ship. Just get them on the planet. It's essentially, if we're talking about sort of making a hyper version of an original series episode, it's Away Mission the movie. And but you don't just beam down, you have your ship obliterated in what, let's say, I think is a very well done action set piece. It's something different as well, that swarm ship. I like those. I'm sure it's probably been done elsewhere, and I'm sure someone will tell me all about it, but it seemed original for Star Trek. You could probably mention the Folian Web or something like that if you really want to. But the ship getting destroyed in an innovative way, I don't know this necessarily is the best looking destruction of any of the Enterprises. I still think the destruction of Star Trek 3 is a gorgeous special effects, but it was something different, and we got to see inside the ship it getting ripped apart. And yeah, I think as an action set piece goes, from the sort of light-hearted, quite quiet opening to take us to that, and suddenly, okay, we're in, this is big, this is all happening, and we don't really know what's going on. Some really nice special effects in there. The new warp effect I thought was really stunning, and still,
yes,
we've not had a lot of chance to sort of admire the Enterprise. I think J.J. Abrams moved his camera about an awful lot, especially in the special effects shot, that sort of post Battlestar Galactica Firefly style special effects going on, and lots of really tight close-ups. But the Enterprise is so nice to look at that you sometimes just want a long shot. Just staring at those shots of the Enterprise, they are stunning in isolation. You probably don't want to spend 45 minutes of a film looking at them, but there were some nice calls back to that, I thought, where you actually got to really look at the Enterprise in space before they tore it to pieces.
Yeah, and I thought perhaps more so with the scenes inside the ship rather than the attack outside the ship. I thought that was all done pretty well. The playing with gravity, we saw some of that in the last film, of course. I thought it was done better here. They sort of played up more to that sort of Inception style of things a lot more. Yeah, that worked pretty well. It felt tense, and that's what you want of it. I think the destruction of the Enterprise probably would have had more impact in these films, even with all of the previous instances, if it hadn't have happened in the last film. And perhaps that's the unforgivable sin. The Enterprise shouldn't have essentially been wrecked into darkness. That shouldn't have happened, and we'd all feel a lot better about it now. In fact, third film in and the Enterprise is destroyed, there's sort of a precedence for that. But no, the whole attack scene, I was enjoying that. I like the idea of essentially needles that stick into the Enterprise as a way of sending in an attack squad. It certainly brought to mind bits of First Contact. Not only because the invading force, also with all the green lights in their masks and things, it just felt a little bit like the Borg invading, although faster. And yeah, that the way it's done felt new. I'm not so keen on the effect of the swarm in space, just because by its very nature as a swarm, it's kind of difficult to pick out anything and relate to anything, because it's just a mass of CGI approaching you. But at the same time, that's kind of the approach they're going for. Just that there's so much you can't do anything against it. Although it did have a few moments of nice effects. The idea of that sort of swarm, like a swarm of bees heading towards you, and the Enterprise firing on it, and it obviously taking out a lot, but just the mass coming towards them, they're unable to do anything about it. That was a nice effect. But essentially, that whole scene there, while we may enjoy it and all of that, it's purely there to get the Enterprise ripped apart and down onto the planet as quickly as possible. With a nice little reference to TNG and separating the saucer to do so.
Yeah, I was quite surprised to see that in there. Essentially separating the saucer from a stump at that point. But it's good, I guess, to give Uhura that hero moment as well. But it also felt very much like that scene in First Contact on the deflector dish, where everyone has to turn the locks at different points, and you have that same sequence played out actually twice in this movie. You have a similar sequence played out in this movie, and actually it's played out in Marvel movies as well, where someone has to unlock the 4 different things, and the last one they don't get until the very last possible second. I suppose it makes sense when this is supposedly a much bigger ship than the Enterprise that we saw, that the saucer section might separate. I thought maybe they'll save the saucer section and that's how we'll get the Enterprise back at the end, although there had been nods towards that anyway on the starbase when they're building a more advanced ship. And great setup for everything there, but it crashes onto the planet.
Certainly one thing to be said about that is that although we're in a planet-based adventure, and certainly that was one of the things that concerned me slightly before we went into it, was that, having had some very earthbound at times stories for the previous 2 films, it sort of felt, well, we're not really going to get off-world much, they're going to destroy the ship straight away. By crashing the saucer into the planet, it meant that we still got more scenes aboard the Enterprise, so it actually didn't feel as bad as I thought it would, because we still had plenty of time aboard the Enterprise. It just happened to be split in half and crashed into the side of the planet. So that was still enjoyable there.
And you can have the precedent as well of Star Trek 4, which doesn't have an Enterprise in it at all until the very last scene as well. I mean, it's a necessary ingredient of Star Trek, but it doesn't have to be the ever-present. You'd say having the characters following Captain Kirk, maybe that's kind of all you need, essentially, in some ways.
Yeah, no, I think so. And on the character front, as we were saying before, with characters being paired off, of course, once they're down onto the planet, they all escape separately with the escape pods, and it leads to what is essentially a lot of this film is characters paired off, slowly coming back together for the action ending. Now we've talked about the fact that Spock and McCoy are teamed up, and actually their interactions are quite nice. I did like the scene just before Spock is beamed out, much to McCoy's annoyance, with Spock talking about, well, you've always had my respect. Now, again, there's that thing of how do we feel about that when what we've got, the evidence for that is the previous 2 films. But if you're coming at it with a wider view of those films and the TV series, I think really this film wants you to. It wants you to consider that those 3 series have happened, but just in a slightly different way into this crew, and you aren't going to see it on the big screen. I thought that was a nice moment.
Yeah, I think it really wasn't. Actually, for the first time in this series of films, I buy Zachary Quinto's Spock, whereas in that last film, where he is just beating up Khan, there's this underlying anger in his performance in the first 2 films, whereas here I feel like he really has nailed the tone of Spock.
I absolutely agree. And you know what, the moment when I really thought, well, that's really what I expect a reaction from Spock to be like, is the moment that McCoy suggests to Spock, you've given your girlfriend a tracking device. And his reaction of, that was not my intention. I thought that's a really little subtle moment, but bizarrely, you've really brought me on board into believing no, that is Spock. That is exactly what I expect there. It's such an innocuous throwaway moment, and these things often are, to be honest. Just the little things you latch onto. And it might just be the turn of a head or just the pause before a sentence. But in the same way that Pine got a few more Shatnerisms in, I felt that Quinto got a bit more of Nimoy in, which is perhaps appropriate considering the reverence to Nimoy in the film, Nimoy having died in advance of it, obviously. But no, I very much enjoyed his performance in this film, despite the fact he's really sort of pushed to the side for a lot of it, by having him injured early on. Although I suppose it's kind of necessary because it means that aside from having more interactions with McCoy as a result, it also means that some of the rest of the cast get a bit more time because you've separated Spock away from Kirk, as we say. And in fact, actually, it gives you that combination of Kirk and Chekhov, which worked a lot better than I was expecting it was going to.
Yeah, because they have played Chekhov as this child genius in this series of films, and now you've got Kirk as the slightly older, jaded captain, so you almost have him as the mentor figure, and this sort of young ensign asking, how did you know this was going to happen? Why don't you necessarily trust? And that kind of thing. And I think it played pretty well. I would still say, Chekhov doesn't have a great deal to do, but more than he's had in previous films, certainly. And Anton Yelchin is just a really likeable screen presence, no matter what.
I think, as you were saying earlier, in the original series, these weren't necessarily characters who were always going to get the prime spot of an episode anyway. If you look at it in that regard, I don't think it's that different from it. But say scenes like when Kirk and Chekhov go back onto the crashed Enterprise to try and find the artifact, I thought that all played out very well. And again, just the idea of the friendships between the crew. I can sort of buy that friendship more than I can buy some of the others, bizarrely. Which I think, as much as anything else, is probably the actors. Just chemistry between the actors, as you'd get after several films. And yeah, obviously, it is going to be a sad loss that he's no longer going to be in the series. He's no longer with us. But in this his final role in this franchise, I thought he did a very good job. And he certainly gets more time than some of the other supporting cast. Obviously, we were saying before about Sulu, enjoying Sulu's performance in this film. Sulu's and Uhura, actually, to an extent, they don't have as much to do because they're in the internment camp, essentially. Sulu's is especially more of a role that's more important when, say, flying the Enterprise, at which point they really sort of push him to the fore. If anyone's underserved, it's perhaps Uhura, but they do try to do an interesting balancing act of having her have the most interactions with the villain, which is it's actually perhaps a good point to get onto the villain, because if the film suffers anywhere, it's perhaps in its villain.
Yes, I would agree with that. So you have a Krall played by Idris Elba. The way I've described it is that he's a Marvel bad guy, with the same weaknesses therein, in that he is after an indeterminate MacGuffin, the powers of which we don't really know or understand, other than in the wrong hands it'll be really destructive. Don't really know why he's angry at everyone. The writers made out, he questions the ethos of the Federation and it's important to question this, and I don't see any of that, really. I mean, he's angry, essentially. And then we get this backstory at the end, which seems a little too late.
I don't know about you. I could see that coming quite early on. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment. I think it was the point when they found the Franklin, and they said, "Oh, no one knows what happened to the crew." You think, that's damned convenient.
I suppose another thing I might have a problem with is, and again, I suppose this goes back to the televisuality of it. This planet, sort of classic sci-fi quarry, essentially, is the idea that they've been luring lots of ships down over the years and using their power, but it's completely uninhabited, essentially, and you don't really feel... I always felt there should be lots of other slaves being kept on. As it is, it's all the nice red, blues and yellows of the Enterprise crew, of which there are many, other than Jayla, who is the kind of other important character.
I think if I'm reading the film right, that yes, that's exactly what the case was, that they were sort of luring ships down like sirens, essentially, and once the ship crashed, they would drain the life energy to sustain their own lives. Which is why you also have those essentially couple of scavengers that take on Scotty early on, and Jayla stops. They're just remnants of crews that are still out and about. And so I suppose they crash a ship and keep them as food, essentially. But yeah, it's never very well explained. It's one of those things that you're sort of puzzling together afterwards, whether that reading is correct or not. I'd kind of have to see it again to sort of put what I think is happening as a framework against what I'm watching, which perhaps is a slightly damning indictment of the film. But it's not really what the film is interested in. The film is interested in the interpersonal. The whole twist with Idris Elba's character did feel, again, while we've talked about things being sort of quite reminiscent of the classic series, that did feel sort of quite reminiscent of the classic series in sort of, if I expected a way for a plot to go, yeah, that's about what I'd expect.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are captains who have set themselves up as gods on planets before. Former Starfleet captains, have either gone mad or have got lost in space. Zefram Cochrane in the original series was kept young and alive forever. There's absolutely a precedent for it, and it's fine, but I don't know. So they've gone through this wormhole, ended up in a different part of space. This is sort of post-Enterprise, this ship, although the ship itself predates Enterprise, so it was about 20-year-old ship captained by Starfleet officer who ended up in this part of space, and then because the Federation abandoned him, they used technology to basically suck the life out of people and stay young. So it's basically a vampire film.
Yeah.
In some ways. I sort of don't care. I feel in the end it wouldn't have mattered if Krall had that backstory or not, because he's looking for this half of the ancient weapon to create this thing that does a thing that kills people. Like, what was any of that about? It's just very much... It doesn't really matter kind of movie making, but there is this artifact that the bad guy must not get their hands on. Yeah,
and the whole thing feels quite televisual, as you say, from that. And yeah, you're quite right with the talk of being like a Marvel villain. It is very much like that. Essentially, you kind of don't care about the villain, and obviously you should care about the villain. In any film, you should. But with Marvel films, generally, you don't. They're just there as someone for our hero to fight against, or for our hero to rescue people from. And essentially, that's what we're dealing with here. The villain is secondary to the need for our crew to rescue the rest of the Enterprise crew. They're just... The villain here is just someone that has to be overcome for that to be done. Which you could view as problematic filmmaking. I absolutely see how it could be. But I guess it's kind of endemic of action films of this end as well, to a certain extent. Now, maybe you expect something more of Star Trek because you also have that end of Star Trek where it's a lot more cerebral. But I guess that's the battle that you have there.
But Star Trek isn't cerebral in the movies. You wouldn't say... And actually,
No.
the final fight sequence set on the Yorktown Starbase, which is, basically Deep Space Nine meets Elysium. And you have this fight, and it's the same fight they have in all the Next Generation movies. It's the captain fighting a bad guy on a platform, essentially. Now, this is done with sort of zero gravity, and it's done... once again, for the third film running, you've got Kirk flying in zero gravity because they just love seeing him do that. And it's fine, and it's quite nicely done, but it's the same thing where, the captain beams over, they've got to stop the bad guy doing something, they fight, and ultimately good triumphs over evil. So from that point of view, I didn't think that particular ending was particularly exciting, but the stuff on the Franklin, all of that stuff, I really enjoyed that.
Oh no, the stuff with the Franklin, you're quite right, is excellent, and actually the way that finished, I thought that was incredibly well done in the sense that I watched it, I thought, I've not really seen that done in Star Trek before. The idea that you use the ship as a barrier, essentially, and it kind of fits. If you're going to sort of do an action-y Star Trek thing, it kind of fits that you're using your ship as a defensive barrier between the attacker and just civilians. It somehow kind of seems fitting. And I thought that was a nice little thing to have in there, and a satisfying end to that section of the fight.
It's the whole Star Trek sort of message that together we come up with solutions to problems. There is no problem we can't solve with our minds and by working together. And simplistic maybe, but it's an optimistic message, and I think probably an important message at this time when everything seems so grim. That was the big problem with Into Darkness, and it's a post 9/11 Star Trek movie, and I don't want a post 9/11 Star Trek movie. I want a big, goofy, kind of optimistic film in some ways, and I think that's embodied in the actions of the crew, certainly, but I think in the character of Jayla as well, who is paired off with Scotty. Now, I found Simon Pegg incredibly painful in this film in some ways. I think if he said Lassie one more time, I was going to walk out, because he's written some terrible cliched Scottish dialogue, more so than the original series ever had, and his accent has got significantly worse. But I think Jayla is a really good character. I enjoyed his interactions with her, and she's very much, she's a survivor. She learns how to innovate, she learns how to do the smart things, and obviously she's the tech to enable the entire film to happen, so very important.
I could see it not being the last that we see of that character. I could see those filmmakers thinking there's a chance to bring that character back in some way, some respect.
Well, in some ways, especially given that there's a spare chair on the Enterprise, and maybe it makes more sense to have a familiar face there in some ways, rather than looking, hey, we've plonked down Ensign whatever in this chair. And I think that would probably be quite fitting, because she worked. She had good chemistry with the crew, and she got more backstory than perhaps Uhura's got.
Despite a lot of it having been cut out of the film, so I'm told. The main thing that I struggled with at first was that I didn't realise who the actress was, and I was just watching for the first 10 minutes or so that she was on screen thinking, what is that accent? It veered from sort of being quite English to sort of being sort of just vaguely European to suddenly back to English. It's like it was an American trying to put on a strange accent. But, of course, it's not at all. It is a European actress. who speaks English. But yeah, that was sort of throwing me for 10 minutes or so watching, thinking, what on earth is this?
The other thing, speaking of accents, is we have a universal translator in this film, and I actually really like this because obviously in Star Trek all the aliens speak perfect English in TV shows. It's a practical thing, but this time we have an alien speaking, and then we sort of have almost like a translation coming not in sync with them, which I thought was quite a nice touch. Quite liked that use. I wasn't quite sure of that character. I wasn't like, are they meant to be part of the original Franklin crew as well, or are they just random aliens that have come that are also bad guys? I don't really know. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I liked the use of the technology anyway.
Again, it's another part of the bad guy's story not being fleshed out enough, really, isn't it? It's purely that because of the kind of film that we're dealing with, though, that once she's crushed by the Enterprise, in a better play out of that kind of effect than in Prometheus, you essentially forget that she was in the film after that point. Now, again, that could very well be a criticism of the film, but I think it also highlights the kind of film that we're dealing with here. It's not one that's going to linger on those issues. As I say, I think in this type of film, as with Marvel film, the villains are but an obstacle for the heroes to overcome. They aren't big, huge, thought-through things, and that is a problem. And certainly anyone looking for a sort of calm character isn't going to get that here. But again, it's not to justify that, but I don't think that's what the filmmakers were aiming for. And perhaps this brings us sort of round onto the issue to close on, which is, what kind of film did they want to celebrate the 50th anniversary with? And now for a long time, I think the answer to that was they didn't know. And that was sort of quite evident by the constant changes behind the scenes.
Yes. I think there's no one really been sort of steering the Star Trek ship of late. I think it was a big loss when J.J. Abrams went to Star Wars, and that threw things up in the air quite a lot, and he didn't have the time to be there day to day as he has been, and he's certainly been big on the promotion trail for it, but he wasn't able to focus on the 50th anniversary, and so one of his lieutenants, Roberto Orci, was brought in, and by all accounts, he can be a difficult character, and it seemed that he was going to direct the film, and Patrick Mackay, J.D. Payne were brought in to write a script with him. They all got ditched. The script apparently is a page one rewrite by Simon Pegg and Doug Jung, written within 6 months to get prep time. And there are a couple of 50th anniversary elements. So, as you say, it evokes the original series. Music cues, there are some very original series style music cues in there, which I kind of loved. When they're fighting, it's almost, the arena kind of Kirk and Spock fight going on, or mock time even, and I really like that kind of element. You have the death of Ambassador Spock, which is fitting. It makes sense. It's quite odd because in some ways I'd rather they didn't even mention that character's in that universe. I think you have to, but it kind of takes away. It's got, this version of Star Trek has a messy time travel created continuity, and they constantly remind us of that. There are 2 Spocks here, and one's really old, and now he's died. But it sets up the Spock arc. Should he stay in Starfleet? Should he depart? Not to say that hasn't already been played in some ways in the previous films, but yeah, that's fair enough. And then you have the picture, the shot of the original crew. I don't know how. I was sort of, yeah, it's good to see them, but it's also, is that it? It feels a little tokenistic in some ways. It's nice to see them, but given that, you know, the current cast doesn't really look like them in any way, is probably a bit jarring in some ways. I was genuinely expecting. Do you remember when they were trying to get William Shatner in the 2009 film and he left a hollow message? I thought that was going to play.
No, that's exactly what I thought was about to happen as well, and I was sort of prepping myself for it. And so when it got to the photo, I thought, oh, that's a nice relief. But bizarrely, you've got this sort of pulling at both ends on that nostalgia front, because with that photo, yes, that is a play into the 50th anniversary, but at the same time, it's on the back of that scene dealing with the fact that Leonard Nimoy has now died. So when I was watching it, I wasn't thinking 50th anniversary. I was thinking, here's a tribute to Leonard Nimoy, bizarrely. And what you were saying before, I kind of thought in advance when they were going to deal with the fact that he was no longer around, I thought what they were going to do was start off with some sort of funeral scene or something like that. Essentially, the reverse of the start of Nemesis. Instead of a wedding, it's a funeral. And I thought that would be awful. The fact that they dealt with it kind of quickly, but it had repercussions on Spock. And essentially, Spock's arc in this film is dealing with, I've seen what my future could be, and can I live up to that? Am I on course to that? And sort of the slowly coming to the realization of to do that, to become as that Spock Prime was, it wasn't by jumping ship, quite literally, and taking on an ambassador's role. It was by sticking with the Enterprise crew, and slowly coming around to that realization. And so when he takes out that picture, it wasn't so much here's a nostalgic look back at the cast for me. It was sort of more Spock suddenly realizing that he's vindicated in his decision of, no, I should stay. And then he sees the photograph, and it's sort of, yes, there's the sign that that's what I should be doing. Of course, if he'd opened the photograph at the start, he could have saved himself an awful lot of trouble. But that's how it played for me. The 50th anniversary was something that I felt in the film elsewhere. As you say, the music cues was definitely one where I was watching them walking around the planet thinking, if this just couldn't be any more reminiscent of the original series at this point. But again, getting back into what did the filmmakers want out of a 50th anniversary, and I think this plays exactly into what I'm saying about the villain problem. What they decided to do with this one was to have something that was reasonably heavily about character interaction. And I think that's the sensible thing to do. And essentially, it's a film that balances that with big action scenes, because that's what this Star Trek movie franchise is. And I don't think you should pull the wool over your eyes, as I think some people do, and say it's something that's only happened with these films. As you said before, the Next Generation films were well down the way to that. They just didn't have a cast that were right to pull that off. Essentially, what you have now is a setup that befits what they were trying to do before, rather than push and pull they had before of trying to balance the take from the TV show with an action film. But again, getting back to exactly how we started with this, that means your opinion on this film could very well depend on what your point of entry with Trek is. And I think that that's something that can be seen in other long-standing projects. I mean, it's only a few years ago you had the 50th anniversary of Doctor Who, for example. Now, the 50th anniversary special was pretty well received, but there were definitely sections of fandom that didn't like it. And quite interestingly, a lot of the recent fans didn't like it because they felt that it wasn't reverent enough of the 4 years that they were particularly fans of. While people who were fans for, say, another 20 years preceding that liked the fact that it was taking note of something there, and other fans didn't like the fact it wasn't taking note of something 30 years before that. When something's been going that long, it's very difficult to please everyone, especially when there's so many quite radically different iterations of it.
I would say overall, how CBS and Paramount have handled Star Trek's 50th anniversary, we have a right to not particularly be satisfied. In some ways, we have a film, which is great. You know, they've got a successful film franchise, something 10 years ago which seemed almost unimaginable. And this film isn't celebrating all of Star Trek. It's very nice nods to the original series. It feels like it's part of that continuity without ramming it down your throat. And when we did the Into Darkness podcast, we said, this feels more like a 50th anniversary film because it's got all these nods to the past, and it's not even nods because it was basically a remake, and it was...
Hey, look, Tribbles!
Yeah. And it felt a bit cheap, a lot of them. It's just like someone sitting with Star Trek Encyclopedia and going, yeah, put that in, that'll do.
This felt much more like it was taking a general tone rather than a specific reference.
Yes, and it felt natural. And I was one of the people saying, well, you've got to make an event out of the 50th. William Shatner should be in this. So that was kind of my thinking. But instead, they have really gone back to basics. They've taken it right down and sort of said, what is Star Trek? And of course the answer is Star Trek is a million different things, and there's no one way of doing it. But they've got the characters, they've re-established the Kirk, Spock, McCoy triumvirate for the first time in this franchise, and they've shown that this crew can work together, that it's an optimistic future, that they want to go on more adventures. And I think probably, rather than going bigger and upping the stakes and trying to cram in characters from the next generation or whatever, that's exactly the right approach. Perhaps it's come about because of chance and because there wasn't enough time to do anything else and because it was a reasonably quick shoot, but yeah, it feels like Star Trek, and I don't think there's any more fitting way to really mark the 50th anniversary than that.
No, and certainly, perhaps as the sort of the note to draw things to a close on, where does this leave the future of the film franchise? It kind of leaves it at an interesting moment in it feels like a choice is there to be made now. Do you try and go for event pictures again? And you could very much argue that Into Darkness was trying to be an event picture. It was trying to sort of be this big Star Trek affair. Sort of, let's try and do a Wrath of... Well, in many ways, let's try and do a Wrath of Khan. And if you look back through the other films, you could argue, say, I suppose Generations probably tried to do that, and Nemesis tried and miserably failed in doing that. But is it now at a point where it's perhaps better to embrace, ironically considering the way this film starts, to embrace that sort of episodic nature? Do we just say the best way for Star Trek to progress on the big screen is not to try and say, hey, look, it's a big affair, but instead it's to do exactly what we talked about before, which is taking something that would normally be on television and saying, okay, here's something that we couldn't quite achieve on television, let's move it into a film, and the film will allow us to achieve that. Because essentially, if the series was to continue in the vein of Star Trek Beyond, I'd be pretty happy. You wouldn't get a film where you'd go, well, that's an absolute classic piece of filmmaking. But I think what you'd end up with is a very satisfying ongoing series. And the talk of the fact that the next film is going to have Kirk's father returning, something that's sort of signposted early on in this film with all of the talk of his father, makes me wonder, what way are they going? Are they trying to make that a big event film, or are they essentially going to treat it the way that the original series might have dealt with that? Because, as you say, there's plenty of instances of them sort of coming across missing Starfleet people, all that sort of thing. What way is it going to go? Or are they going to treat it, say, more like the Next Generation would treat it? And in doing that, are they opening themselves up to the possibility of a very bad failure?
We're about to enter a new phase of Star Trek. We've got a new series starting on Netflix and CBS All Access in the US, and so it's an exciting time. It's almost Star Trek back to the peak of its powers, being both a movie franchise and TV at the same time, something we've not seen since the 90s, essentially. So there's a lot of new ways to tell stories in Star Trek, and who knows, maybe with the Netflix show, I don't quite know if it's going to be anthology or if they're going to have one single show running for years, or if even have got multiple shows in mind. So they'll probably have an eye on the future of the movie franchise there as well, you would think. But I think this crew certainly has a good couple more movies in them, and I'd certainly like to see them. Well, I'd actually like to see them go on until they have to wear the maroon uniforms of old and get old and fat and still be trying to save the universe.
I would very much hope that they don't ignore the possibility that when you reach that point, I don't want them to consider that you reach that point, you have to empty out the entire cast and essentially do a Next Generation on it. Because I kind of think that one of the best things that Star Trek could do at this point, and it's, as you said earlier, it's something that's about to be forced upon them by Anton's sad death, is just to have rotating cast, because, well, they're about to have to do so, but that's a good way of stopping that being an issue. Just, people will gradually leave. It could very well have been the case that we didn't have McCoy in this film. Carl Urban was out of contract and initially wasn't planning on returning. We would have had a new character in there on that basis. I could see it going that way. I in many ways, I think that might make more sense, at least certainly in the short term. 10 years down the line or something, then maybe that would be a different case. But just because actors' contracts make things a little complicated, I'd like to see them just try and continue, and if they lose some along the way, then so be it, and let's try and see what else we can bring into that team.
Yeah, and we've got a new ship now as well. I mean, I thought that was a little bit cheap, and oh look, the Enterprise is essentially disposable now. We've got the Enterprise A now, about 30 years early, and it looks pretty much the same as far as I could tell. I was really hoping it would be the Enterprise A design, but I guess that's a thing of the past. But I'm interested to see what the ship looks like. I'm sure it'll look different. I'm sure there probably will be new crew members, and yeah, that's some excitement for a few emissions more. But let's just sum up. It's good. It's not great, but it has potential to be more liked, I think, over time. I'd like to see it again, certainly, which I did not really think of Into Darkness. I've never gone back and revisited it, certainly. Maybe just because of the overall bleak tone of it. But yeah, I think it's a good film. I think it sums up Star Trek pretty well. If you had to sum up Star Trek in 2 hours in a big screen action movie, yeah, it does what it sets out to do. I think it's not big, it's not grand in scale, it's not big in idea, but it is big in character, and perhaps that's exactly what it should do.
No, I think that's entirely fair. It's in terms of an ongoing series, it's perhaps a middling episode, but maybe that's kind of what the franchise needed at this point. Something that's just absolutely acceptable. It sounds like I'm being a lot more critical than I actually feel that I am. Solid. It's absolutely solid, and that's what I wanted. There's problems with it. There's no question. There's parts that are underwritten, the villain especially. But I feel that we're on a lot more solid ground for moving forwards than we were with the last film. And I feel that we now have a much better basis for an ongoing series. And somehow that feels fitting for the 50th anniversary. Now, whether, as I say, this is your Trek or not, will very likely colour your perception of things. And I think it's definitely a film that is calling back to the original series far more than any other element of Star Trek. If you're a massive Voyager fan, this film doesn't really care. This film is not trying to, in celebrating the 50th anniversary, it's not trying to encompass all of Trekdom. It's trying to celebrate that initial start of Star Trek. And that's quite evident by the various callbacks to the original series. But, as you say, in the goals that it sets itself and what it sets out to achieve, I kind of feel that it meets those targets. And for a summer blockbuster, as essentially that's what Star Trek films are now, and the TV series I'm sure will be something else entirely, but the Star Trek films are summer blockbusters now. It's a lot more of an enjoyable affair than a lot I've seen recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So there you go. That's our review, rambling at times, of Star Trek Beyond. But we will be back again very soon for a regular episode of First Contact, we promise. But thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.